In the early 70s, had always driven sports cars on the road, and my brother, I always blame it on him, he said, wouldn't it be great if, I was always getting rid of one to get another one, and he said, wouldn't it be great if you had a bunch of different ones, that you could try out, and something sort of snapped in my head, and here I am, broke but happy, 15 years later. This is the oldest car I have, which is a 1917 Duesenberg Indianapolis car. It's typical of all the racing cars before 1920 because it's just great, big, and strong. That's the best thing you can say about them. There's nothing elegant, nothing very refined about them. It's got a huge four-cylinder engine with what they call walking beams. It's got these levers on either side that do that, and the valves do this. And they have made 8-valve versions and 16-valve versions, and this is the only 16-valve car that survives. And I traded a lot of cars to get into this one. A nice old fellow out of Long Island had taken it apart, used to drive it around on the roads. Had some wonderful pictures of him driving around on the roads. Took it apart, didn't get it back together, so I got it and sent it over to England and had it all put together. And there are all kinds of great stories with every car. This is different. When you trace the ownership, this car was owned in the 20s by a retired circus performer who kept it in a log, sort of a log cabin kind of a thing, where he also kept his bear that was left over from the circus. And this was in upstate New York, and during the parades, the annual parades, he and the bear would drive down the main street of town in this car. This car is quite fast. I've been over 100 miles an hour in it, but it just won't stop because it doesn't have any brakes on the front, and it has very primitive brakes on the back. So it really should be driven on a track as opposed to a road course. In the teens and 20s, they had these board tracks all over this country, which were wooden kind of saucers, and you could go flat out all the way around. They were very steeply banked, and so when you drive this thing on a road course, you're really not doing what it was designed to do. And okay, so moving on from there. This is a Bugatti Brescia, which was actually designed before the First World War, and they made a few of them. And the Germans overran the Bugatti factory twice, right after the First World War and after the Second World War. And they had made 3 of these things in 1914, and they knew the Germans were coming, so they took them apart and wrapped them in oily rags and buried them in the factory yard. And then after the war, they came back to the factory, put them together, and won a famous race at Brescia, Italy. Therefore, this kind of Bugatti is known as the Brescia. Now, Bugatti is the most interesting car personality, in my opinion, because he was not trained as an engineer. He was trained as an artist. His father was a portrait painter, made decorative chimneys. Did all this crazy stuff that didn't have anything to do with mechanical things. And so Bugatti designed things by just sort of grokking how a part should be. And he had this amazing tie in his mind between how a part should look and its function. They said that as he was really into thoroughbred horses, and they said as he could judge the foot of a really good horse, so could he judge the forces that would go into a particular car part. And he sketched everything in 3 dimensions, and then he had a bunch of sort of closet engineers that would do the math to actually check out the pieces. But you get the pieces on Bugattis are so satisfying because they all have this wonderful sense of sort of design and beauty. And he said if it looks right, it is right. And so there's this aesthetic tie to the actual function of the car, gives them a sort of a different dimension that you don't get on some of the other cars. Bugatti went on from this thing, this Brescia, and they made road versions and racing versions. This is a racing car. It looks kind of cute and spindly, but it's not. It's a very tough car. They used to race 6 and 7 hours on dirt roads with great big chuck holes and stuff. And so there's a very, very, very brawny little car. And Bugatti had sort of made 3 and 4 of everything he'd made until this, and this one really put him in a world-class basis to make road cars, racing cars, and make him sort of the world name that he then became. This next Bugatti is a copy of a 1923 Bugatti Grand Prix car, which was an early experiment in aerodynamics. And it's a copy. I'll explain about that in a minute. But in some ways, it's fairly successful. I had a modern aerodynamicist that told me just recently. He said a lot about this car is very much in line with current thinking on aerodynamics. The fact that it's flat on the sides, that it has a very long tail, and I told him that they had wheel covers in the old days. He said a lot of that is really good. He said the front of a car really doesn't make much difference. It's not how you enter the car, it's how you turn loose of the air after you've penetrated it. But there's only one original tank, Bugatti tank in the world. That's what it's nicknamed. And we talked our way into a museum in France, and this guy that's restored so many cars for me sketched up the entire car in 2 hours. We only had 2 hours to do it. And he sketched every rivet, the way the axles work, the steering gear, the body, the whole thing. And 2 hours, 2 years later, presented me with this car. We had the engine for it, and he made all the rest of it, the transaxle, everything. It's a real tour de force of craftsmanship. And the making of new cars is a temptation to do that in historic racing because they are so expensive. It's very much frowned upon unless it's some bizarre thing of which there are no examples around it. And then it's sort of excused if you come up with something that everybody was sort of interested in and wanted to see what it was like anyway. And you have to be very honest. Well, I made practically the whole thing. If you fudge and say, well, we did have quite a bit of the original car, then that's not so good. The next one is these two are the green one and the red one here are Indianapolis racing cars. This one from the mid-20s and this one from the late 20s. And Miller was the great American genius, and he similarly had an aesthetic tie between how he drew his pieces, how they looked, and how they actually functioned. And he was part of an amazing triumvirate of fellows. One was Leo, and he was the sort of concepts man, the genius, the dreamer. Then he had a very practical man named Leo Guzman, who was the draftsman, who would figure out how these crazy things that Miller conceived could actually be made in a production setting. And then there's a third guy, Offenhauser, who was the shop foreman, who was a very good craftsman, could actually make these difficult pieces. And the shops were out in L.A., and the cars were extremely fast. This car would have lapped at about 100 miles an hour in Indianapolis, and this one over here would have lapped at about 115. Four tracks flat out all the way around where they would have probably gone 135, 140 in a circle. This car, the problem with the Millers is that most of them were modified to extinction, so that there wasn't anything left of the original cars. The Europeans, with their sense of sort of cosmic materialism, usually realized that Grand Prix cars were artifacts to be sort of revered and preserved, whereas Americans, bless their hearts, would say, oh, this is something, well, let's just cut 2 feet out of the chassis and put a new motor in it, and get this axle. So at the end of the day, there really aren't any Millers that have survived. This one, a guy in the early 30s, fortunately realized that it was something to be preserved and therefore kept it together. This is 122 cubic inches, or 2-liter, which was what they did in the mid-20s. In the late 20s, the Millers all the way through the 20s got smaller and faster. The engines kept getting only half as big. They'd be much, much faster. This car we have just finished, and it is a recreation. This is quite an original car, and this is not. We started with the engine and transmission, which we got from a nice old fellow in Colorado Springs, and luckily all the Miller drawings survived, so much of this car was made in England. The frame, the body, and a lot of the hardware was made. I got bits and pieces from 20 different guys that would allow me to have stuff off of them. And but anyway, I just raced this car out of Monterey and passed all the Bugattis but one. And it is also a straight A. It has a centrifugal blower in the back. It produces, in stock form, 154 horsepower out of 1,500 cc's, which is a lot of specific output. In a tweaked up form, there was a guy named Frank Lockhart who won the race in 26, and he would get 250 horsepower out of 1,500 cc's. So the Millers were a phenomenal engine. And if you look at the engine of this Indy car here, it looks just like a great big Miller. The design was laid down in the 20s for the quintessential American racing engine, and they just basically kept pumping them out really until the early 70s. It's pitiful how that we couldn't seem to come up with anything else, but they were just very good, and they just kept making them. But I had a great time racing this just a couple of weeks ago. I had all the feel of the original car, so we must have gotten the spring rates and the shock rates just right. We have made these little narrow tires, which are correct, but in a very, very fast sweeping corner where you're setting up in a slide, all you can see is that you're going along on about 3 inches of rubber times 4, you know, and you think, do I really want to be doing this, you know? But the Millers were terrific cars, and I'm in the process of sort of trying to recreate a couple of more. And sadly enough, there aren't any to speak of that survive, and so there are projects all over the country where guys are trying to sort of get a few bits and pieces and get to a car, which is what we've done here. The next, this is my favorite car, which is a Type 37A Bugatti. This is a Grand Prix car from the 1927-1928 period. The most famous Bugatti was a Type 35, which looks just like this body and chassis-wise, but has a straight 8 engine that comes out that fills this whole space in here. This engine was sort of or this car was kind of a Formula 2 car, or a car for somebody that wasn't enthusiastic about campaigning something that was really high-tech. This is got a plain bearing engine, not lower bearings, but it's still a very, very robust car. And I've had more fun with this car than any other one. Bugatti Grand Prix cars make wonderful dual-purpose cars, which is something that few do. This is a good sports car to enjoy on the road on a long trip, and they also are wonderful to race. The car, as soon as you get in and start driving it, it makes you feel like driving fiercely. It gives you so much confidence. It makes you feel that it's not going to surprise you. It makes you want to throw it around in the corner. And in the pre-war cars, that's often not true. Often the pre-war racing cars are a chore to drive, but not the Bugattis. They are absolutely terrific. Bugatti was a genius about chassis. He understood in sort of this non-analytical way. He sort of grokked how much the chassis should bend, how much the springs should give, how the shock should be, to the point that there's nothing like a Bugatti in the chassis department as far as going a corner. Other early racing cars feel a lot like trucks, but not Bugattis. So this is a great old car. I've worn it out about 3 or 4 times. Had it restored. The man that had it before me crashed it twice. I have a wonderful picture of him lying in the middle of the track, having fallen out, and the thing flying over him. In a very tweaked up form of line, they're in the lap of Brooklyn, a famous track in England, at 122 miles an hour. So that was really maximized. A guy named Chris Stanley. It doesn't have this strange-looking body on it. It would look almost exactly like this car. The chassis is the same. It's a Grand Prix Bugatti. It is the early 30s version of this car, wherein Bugatti took his single cam straight 8 and put a twin cam engine on it. Then this crazy looking body was put on either as a factory by Jean Bugatti as a prototype of the Atlantique series. There's a series of 4 or 5 Bugattis which are sort of 3 feet longer, have generally the same lines. It's either that or it was made after those larger cars were done. Somebody took a Grand Prix chassis to a coach over and said, here, do me something like one of these swoopy bodies on this shorter chassis. And I started this project with a copy of this body, which was made in the late 60s, and I was so enamored with the shape, I was prepared to go with a completely unoriginal car. We found a chassis and did an engine, and scrounged up stuff, got right to the end, and we were going down to Monaco, where the man owned this original body, and it had a lot more stuff on it, the windows, and we were measuring everything. And finally he said, you take the original body, I will take the copy. He owed me a little money, not very much. He said, you're so fanatical about this project, you should finish it with the proper thing. So that was about the nicest thing that's ever happened in the car business. And I said, you shouldn't be doing this. This is crazy. He said, I got too many projects, you take it. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth. So I said, that's fine, I will. So we finished it a year ago. I've raced it a couple times. It unfortunately compromises the great Bugatti chassis qualities because it's steel quite top-heavy, and in the fast sweepers it's a little twitchy. But it's very quick in a straight line. We're running it on methanol, and we're getting ready to go on a rally this next week, and we're going to take this one into Russia over here. The next car in line is this red Maserati here, which is a 1933 Maserati Grand Prix car. In the 30s, there was no restriction on the engine size, so you got a lot of very powerful engines. They didn't really have the engineering capability to build chassis that could handle all that power. So you got to get cars that were very, very fast in a straight line, but they're not a lot of fun to drive. The old, called cart-slung chassis are not sufficient and are sophisticated enough to get all that power to the ground. That car won the French Grand Prix driven by Giuseppe Ferrari, one of the great portly racing drivers in the Ferrari great family. And we resurrected it over many years. The engine has never quite been right. I said it was an expert in the engine. Do it properly and design it. That's it. I hope it'll be racing. Let's see. I'll skip ahead to this Indianapolis. Skipping ahead a little bit. This is a good cooling special at Indianapolis. It ran to 8th or 9th place a couple times. The Indianapolis design got very stultified in the 50s period. The Europeans were sort of moving ahead with all kinds of new technology. The Americans got up to a certain point and didn't advance very much. This has a tubular frame that is pretty basic. The English would say agricultural. That's their terrible adjective to describe something that's sort of too heavy and too crude. It has a four-cylinder Offenhauser engine, which looks, Offenhauser being the guy that kept the sort of Miller ideas alive, and it looks incredibly like we'll take the hood off here in a minute, but it looks very much like these Millers. It was a big four-banger version of these Miller straight eights, and they kept running them really till the early 70s. An ex-Indy mechanic restored this for me. I haven't even driven it yet. We finished it this year, and it's got disc brakes and some strange thing called a Jacob's ladder rear suspension. And the trouble is there isn't really any serious vintage racing for Indy cars, so I don't know what I'm going to do with it. But the most high-tech things that they did have were the so-called laydowns. This engine is up straight, and the laydowns had the offie over on their side, and they were much more low-slung. They were only about this high, and those were the things that won the race in the late 50s. Up here, the third car over, which we'll look at in a minute. Jack Brabham came over in the early 60s, an Australian who had won the Grand Prix a couple times, and entered it in Indy, and that triggered the Indy car revolution, where they started putting the engine in the back, and they called it the funny little car, and it was green, which was a obscenity superstition-wise in Indy, and that was a horrifying thing when he came over. And he got 5th place in the car with about half the horsepower of the rest of them. And it triggered a whole sort of design revolution there, and they eventually, within a couple of years, they were all mid-engine cars as they had been in Indy, as they had been in Europe for several years. Let's see, moving on to this red car here. This is a Ferrari Grand Prix car from 1955. It has a 4-cylinder engine. The transmission is in the back. This particular car started in 52 and 53 as a Formula 2 car, and it was very successful, and Ferrari kept designing new cars that the drivers didn't like. He would have this one thing that looked wonderful on paper, but that nobody could drive. And so they kept going back to these old things called Tipo 500s and updating them. They changed the springs and make a little more swoopy body work and sort of do some minor things, improve the brakes, but they were basically the same old frames. And this one even ran ran until 1955. That was the final update of the Tipo 500s. This car ended up in Paraguay and was then in very delicate condition. It had a Chevrolet engine in it, an incorrect body. And it was found by an English dealer, and I bought it from him, and we then commenced to restore the thing. We went down to France to Pierre Gardinant, who has an original body on, he has the identical car, took this English panel beater with him, and these are these guys that are absolutely incredible that can make a body from just flat sheets of aluminum. And of all the crafts in the restoration business, the panel beating is the most hard. It's so difficult, you can't understand it. There are very few people that can do it. They have these wheeling machines, which are two steel rollers like this, and they give a foot pedal where you squish the rollers together, and you roll the aluminum back, you roll it back and forth, and it squishes it down. So as it squishes it down, it's got to have some place to go, so it humps up. And you can stand there and make a hump in metal, but to actually make a tail and have the line come out, and all of these lines meet at the back of the car, it's just, I mean, there are very few people that can do it. It's a knack that a lot of people try to become panel beaters, but very few people can. This guy, this fellow that we took down to France with us, had nothing but, he had some sort of wooden-looking medieval sort of calipers and a roll of brown paper, and he had made these sort of druidical notes and laid the paper across the original thing and rubbed it with his dirty hands and made some notations and tucks and stuff. And, I mean, I didn't know what he was doing. And he couldn't explain it either. He was totally inarticulate. He was not able to. He could do it, but he couldn't explain it. And a year and a half later, came out with this body, and it fit perfectly. And from every angle, it is exactly the same as the pictures. So anyway, I'm lucky to have this car because Ferrari did not make single-seater racing cars to sell. He only made them to race for his own team, whereas, for instance, Maserati made 30 examples of the 250F, and there are quite a few of those around. So this is a quite rare car, and I have the corresponding Maserati to it, which was Sterling Moss's old 250F. It's not here now. It's over in England having some work done on it. And, very, very interesting comparison between the two cars. The Ferrari here is very strong, very robust, very kind of abrupt in everything it does. The Maserati is very soft and forgiving. They're both quick, but they're quick in different ways. And I am very, very privileged to be able to sample all these things and compare them with the written descriptions of them. That is the great pleasure. And you read all there is to read about a certain era of racing, a certain type of car, kind of engineering, theory, and then to actually get in the car and in a tactile way be able to tie in your own experience is an incredible privilege. Let's see. This is a 1953 Ferrari sports racer from the early 50s period when Ferrari was combating against huge Allards that had Cadillac engines in them. And it has a great big engine, 4.5 liters. It's a 375 Mille Miglia. That's the first of a series of about 10 of these things that they made, and were quite successful cars. It retired while leading at Le Mans in '53, driven by Ascari and Villaresi. I don't see how Ascari or Villaresi ever got in the car because he's a big, tall fellow, and you really have to respect drivers from this early era because the car is very uncomfortable to sit in. The gear shift and the steering wheel hit your leg. There's no way to push the seat back because there's some suspension pieces here. It's extremely loud and hot inside, and I don't see how a big, tall man got in here. This car also ran the Mexican road race, came fourth. They raced 5,000 miles all the way across Mexico. I was terrified of it when I first got it. I didn't. It has strange little leaf springs in the front. It heels over a lot, but I finally raced it on a big, long course, European-style course at Road America, and all of a sudden I began to understand it. It's not designed for little sort of darty street courses. It's designed for a big, long, fast, serious course, and now I very much enjoy it. It's got a lot of power, tremendous amount of torque. It'll go 155, 160 miles an hour, but you have to make sure that you shut off in plenty of time for the corner because it's quite heavy and it's just got the old-fashioned drum-style brakes. But like any Ferrari that's really right, it gives you the feeling that it would just run forever. The Ferraris have this kind of eternal feeling to how robust and how well made they are. Ferrari engineering is usually very conservative. He lets other people try out the new far out stuff, and then when it's been proven, he finally puts it on his cars. So that this kind of car, and really any of these Ferraris, you feel that short of hitting a tree, the car will keep going and going and going. And it's quite an experience to ride in this thing. It's extremely loud on the inside. You have to use earplugs. Very, very hot. The sheet metal all rattles and stuff, and the thing heels over. But It is really, it's fun. I mean, it sounds horrible, but it's not. It's terrific. This car, it spent some time in Denver in the late 50s. It had this non-original nose put on it. One time I was driving it from San Francisco down to Los Angeles. I left it in a gas station in Santa Barbara. And when I got there the next morning, there was a business card under the thing, and the guy said, "I used to own this car. I'm only here tonight. I'm a bush pilot." I went down to the port. Sure enough, the guy was only there that night. He happened to be driving by. He saw the tail of the car sticking out. I mean, to talk about ships passing in the night. He sent me some parts for the car that he still had, and amazing thing. Raced it a lot. I like to only race it on really long courses because it's really designed for a European course where you have very, very, very fast sweeping curves. On a little tiddly course with Lotus-like corners, it would be just obnoxious. But it's designed to go really fast. It is like any. The really good Ferraris give you this feeling that of tremendous strength and durability. They are so thoroughly engineered. Everything. Ferrari engineering is quite conservative. He doesn't go with anything far out until it's been proven for years and years. This thing, all the systems are double. The electrical system is double. The differential is about that big. The transmission gears are about that wide. It gives you the feeling that short of hitting a tree, the thing would run forever. It just goes and goes and goes and goes. I was terrified of it. It's got sort of leaf springs in the front and all kinds of weird, archaic things in the suspension. I was terrified of it when I first drove it because it's very fast. It has a lot of power. But when I got it on the proper course and learned to drive it, because it heels over a lot, it's kind of like sailing. But it really, when you get it all kind of doing what it's supposed to do in the proper venue, it's a lot of fun. The brakes are pretty good. It'll on a long straight, it'll wind itself to up to 150, 160 miles an hour. But you've got to make sure that you don't come into the corner too hot because it takes a long time to slow down. It's big and heavy. And it's pretty exciting inside. It's very, very noisy. All the sheet metal gets hot. The driving position is fairly horrific. I don't see how the big tall guys drove it. Bill Raisy, who's about that tall, I don't see how he ever did because there's no way to move the seat back. You have to really admire the drivers of this era because there's no thought for driver comfort at all. That didn't come in until sort of in the middle 50s with the 250F Maseratis and stuff. They had so many guys who wanted to drive these, they didn't have to care. They just sort of put a wooden chair in there and said, if you don't like it, we'll get somebody else. But, this car lived in Denver in the late 50s. It had this nose put on here by someone in Denver. And there are many other interesting stories about it, which I'll be glad to say on a private basis. This is a 1956 Ferrari sports racer, 290 Mille Miglia, which is a 3.5-liter V12. It's the first car when Ferrari turned away from the 4-cylinder cars, and 6-cylinder, which he was fooling around with in 54, 55. 56, he went back to V12s. A French historian thinks that this is the actual car that won the Mille Miglia in 1956, which is a 1,000-mile race around Italy. It was driven by Eugenio Castellotti, who was a genius driver. He drove in a pelting rainstorm where many drivers just stopped and said they couldn't go any farther, and he averaged something like 100 miles an hour around the whole thing. We took this thing back to Italy for the Mille Miglia redo the historical race in May. So you're welcome to have one of the little brochures that describes the adventures we had, which were formidable. It was scrupulously prepared, but we still had a lot of trouble with it, and we had a lot of heroic mechanical things, repairs at the side of the road that I certainly didn't help in, but I sort of looked on anxiously. We kept thinking we'd have to retire it, but it just kept going. And we were getting we were getting water in the oil, which is a big no-no. And I kept thinking, we better shut this thing off. And I got into this thing where I was sort of talking back and forth in the car, and the car was saying, work me, this is, I could do this and I could do more. You don't understand. I've raced this car for years, and I thought I kind of understood its capabilities, its limitations, and what I was doing was about 20% of what it could really do. I'm not enough of an athlete to really draw out of the car what it could do, but it was an amazing experience with this thing. The car, we just kept sort of fiddling with all the things that we thought were breaking, and it always ran fine. It had a huge amount of power, and it just kind of kept going on and on and on, 15, 16 hours a day for 2 days and a little more. And we completed finally at 1 in the morning on the last day we completed the whole course. But it was an incredible experience to get to drive it. It was, if you had to give somebody a quick course in Italy, to have them drive a Ferrari in the Mille Miglia Retrospective would be quite a good way, because you have the cars and the speed and the noise and the people and the food and the landscape and the buildings, and then you get this increasing exhaustion where you're more and more spaced out. And it's a profound experience, and I hope to be able to. We have to make new cylinder heads for this car because they're cracked and the water is going through, which is going to be a long project. And I would love to run this car again on another Mille Miglia. To drive the car, the Mille Miglia is just everything, all the elements of Italy squashed into one violent experience. You know, the food, the speed, the cars, the buildings, the incredible enthusiasm of the people who are standing there by the side of the road, literally with tears coming down their faces sometimes, waving their arms. You know, so, I mean, they are a nation of people that are truly enthusiastic about cars. I mean, everybody in Italy, they're all fabulous drivers who'll be passing really where you shouldn't because there's regular traffic on the road. There'll be a truck coming around the other corner, the truck will just move over, maybe sort of brushing the trees over here. The other guy will get over, you know, and they're all waving at you and they make a little hole. It's great. You know, they just think it's no sweat. You know, they're all sort of machine athletes. You know, they're all frustrated racing drivers, and so we had a lot of adversity with this car. We've gone to a lot of trouble to prepare it scrupulously. We started getting water in the oil, which we should have just shut it off. But I got into this thing where the car was sort of talking to me. I was thinking, I said, I better shut off my car. I said, work me, you know, just do something, you know. And so I did, you know, and it just kept going and going and going. I mean, Ferraris when they're right, they just go forever. And we had a drama with the clutch, which we took out and had to learn to lathe on a Saturday afternoon and make a piece and get it back together. So it was really, it was awful. If it wasn't real racing, it was awfully close to real racing. Let's say we go back over here to continuing the single-seater history. This is the Ferrari was 1955. This is 1956, and it shows the Italians, the English, began to dominate racing in the late 50s and 60s. They came in with very lightweight cars that were not terribly powerful. They had great handling characteristics. This is one of the first Lotus single-seaters. It's the Lotus 12, and it's Ferrari is 1955, and this is 1956. So you can see this is the beginning of when the English began to sort of take over racing. They came in with cars that were very light, not very powerful, but very, very good handling, a lot of new thinking in the suspension, a lot of attention to adding lightness, as they say. This car is sort of a recreation. It's not very original. We have to make a transmission for it. It has a 2-liter climax, and it should be wicked fast. It's only sort of 800 pounds all up when it's done. It ran in Formula 2. People like Graham Hill drove it, and they ran them in Formula 1, and they actually did pretty well. They were beginning to embarrass the big Ferraris and Maseratis with these sort of big classical-looking things, much heavier, much more solid, and the English were coming with these darty things. So I'm really looking forward to driving this. This is a Cooper, and this is really a pivotal car. Jack Brabham, who was an Australian guy, won the World Championship in '59 and '60 in a car like this. And this is the '60 version of it, so-called low-line car. This is the first car to have adjustable suspension, where you could, like that Ferrari over there, the camber and the caster and not the toe end, but basically all your suspension configurations are constructed into the car. This car, you could dial in the suspension and the spring rates and all this kind of stuff for every individual course, and the tire conditions and the heat and everything else. And Brabham was something you don't have nowadays. He was a combination mechanic and driver, and the Cooper story is quite interesting. These guys had a 3-bay gas station, and they won the World Championship twice. And they had about 10 guys working for them, and they were up against Ferrari and Maserati that had 200 or 300 people working on the team. And they were very determined and sort of pragmatic kind of guys. They had these Climax engines. They weren't afraid to try new things, and they made these cars that were wonderful to drive and really gave the drivers courage to try quite hard in them. And then this car a car like this came over to Indianapolis, and as you mentioned, triggered the whole mid-engine revolution in Indy. So the Coopers were really quite something, especially considering that they took very little resources to be as illustrious as they were. Okay, this is the early 60s. This is 1960. This is 1964. This is my first racing car, which sadly enough I just sold. This is a Le Mans car. That's a 3.3-liter sports racing car designed for endurance racing. Probably tweaked up and properly set up. It would probably go 180, 190 miles an hour. It gives you a tremendous feeling of strength, like all Ferraris. It's a V12. It's quite streetable. It just isn't a car that I happen to race very much, and it sat here in my garage for years, and the guy came along and made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and I had sold it to him. And I'm feeling quite wistful walking around and seeing it here, because it's been an old friend for years, and I feel rather disloyal to it. Let it go. When we go to, this is the Ferrari LM, which is the first racing car I bought, and I had just sold it the last week. It sits here. It's a great old car, but I never drive it. And it's a Le Mans car. You can see the lights here on the door, which will illuminate the number, so as the car would go by the pits at night, they could see which car it was. It's a 3.3-liter V12. It would probably do 180, 190 miles an hour with the right gearing in it and stuff. But the guy made me an offer I couldn't refuse, so it is now gone. I'm feeling very sad and nostalgic, and I'm feeling a little bad that I've sort of rejected the whole thing. It's been so faithful to me all these years. I have more fun with it.
And that's a brush up.
They ought to be exempt.
Yeah. Or you buy rusted, horrible wrecks, and have the patience to fix it. Yeah. That's incredible. The transmission's all back here.
Quick change brake pads, pulling some pins out, brake calipers.
And that's a 275 engine? Even the 250s were actually 275.
That's right. That's right.
This is a street car, isn't it?
Well, it was, it's actually built as a racing car. They tried to run them in the street car class, the GT class, and they wouldn't accept them. They had a hassle, so they finally had to run them in the prototype class, and they were not that competitive in the prototype class. They did win at Le Mans one year, and that's fairly competitive. Oh yeah, yeah, they were a great car.
Very cool.
Yeah. But see, that's a tube frame. Right after this, they went to monocoque, more or less.
How much does it weigh?
About 1,700.
Really pretty much.
300 horsepower.
This weighs less than my Dino? That's awesome. Thank you. You're welcome.
The new owner's completely restored. It's a long 66 Eagle Indy car. Creation of Dan Gurney. Let's see. This is the very first Eagle. This blue thing here. Dan Gurney was a great American hero and raced in Europe and was determined to bring European racing ideas and technology back to this country. He promoted a bunch of money from Goodyear. He hired the designer of the Lotus that won Indianapolis in 1965, and they basically redrew the car in '66 and called it an Eagle. If you look at the '65 Lotus, it's nearly identical to this car. It was fabricated in Santa Ana. And it was this was the very first car. He was in, they had a terrible crash on the first lap of the 566. Gurney told me he was driving this car and he never had such a profound and sudden reversal of his fortunes, because he was coming around the pace lap thinking how blessed he was to have been able to promote this car, to raise the money, to get the designer, to get the thing fabricated, and they actually did a whole motor that was partially designed. This is kind of the very end of the Miller era. There's some Miller Offenhauser thinking in this V8 motor. We got that all together. They got the beautiful car together. It's called an Eagle, and it has the Eagle snout. This is so anyway, he was coming around the very first lap thinking, isn't life great? And then he looked up and he saw these tires flying up in the air and dust, and all these cars were smashing into each other and slewing around, and he was sort of having these phenomenal avoidances, carving himself through by these scenes of tragedy. And he sort of broke out into the daylight, thinking that he had avoided everything, and was immediately T-boned on the side, and tore the wheels off of both sides, and he skidded to a stop. So he said he went from the absolute mountain to the bottom of the valley in the space of a couple seconds. But these were quite good cars. They were incredibly robust. They went ahead and they finally did win in Indianapolis. And the Eagles are in '72 were the absolute cars to beat in the entire world. But the story sort of started here. Mike DePuja has done so much work. Worked on Eagle 5,000 cars in the late '60s. They made a lot of different kind of stuff. And in this particular year, the very first year, they also made a Formula One car, and the USAC, or the Indianapolis tub, and the Formula One tubs were identical, except the USAC tubs were a little heavier. So the Ernie Westlake V12, if you're familiar with that, is almost identical to this car, except the engine is different. Yeah. Let's see, the Tyrrell over here is Jackie Stewart's car when he won the middle of his 3 World Championships. It's quite an easy car to drive. I'm sure I drive it at about 5/10. But it's you stand on it and you think, wow, this is the fastest thing I've ever sat in, and then after that it comes on the cam, and you think, now I'm going to pass out. I prefer the Grand Prix cars rather than the Indy cars because they are designed for, they're much kinder to the drivers. The gear shift is handy, the pedals are all set up for double clutching, the seat and where you sit fits you all the way along your body so you can get all the messages of what the car is doing. And I've had some real fun with that, with the Tyrrell over the years. Stewart drove it on a demonstration out at Monterey a few years ago and shrieked around a few laps and came in and said, well, he said I wasn't really going fast enough to warm the tires, but I had a good time. He told me a couple of things, and then somebody that was timing everybody on the weekend then later told me that he was 5 seconds a lap quicker than anybody else there. On the entire weekend, including some great big Can-Am cars and stuff. So that shows the difference between a world-class athlete and a bunch of sort of a Walter Mitty types. Years I've gotten so that I can actually drive it a little bit. The Grand Prix cars are always much more pleasant than the Indy cars because they're designed with the pedals proper spacing so you can double clutch. The gear shift you can reach easily. The seating is right so that you contact the car all the way down your body and legs to get the signals of what the car is doing. It's really quite a pleasant car to drive, as opposed to my last car, which is the Ferrari of 1974, by which time the technology had developed to such a point that I can almost not drive the car. The first time I got in the thing, I was just idling around for a couple of laps to warm up the transmission stuff, and I spun while I was idling. What I'm doing in these things. So, between those two cars from 71 to 73, the requisites of the athletic requisites of driving things like that have just sort of almost gotten beyond it. The engine is wonderful, like a Ferrari should be. It makes power, has a lot of low speed, it makes power all the way through the range. It's just extremely twitchy with the transient chassis department. It doesn't give you any signal of what it's going to do. It just goes away and it all set. And it's also designed for the making loud the person is a fifth of the size of itself. It's extremely tight. There's some other cars that we're still working on that are in the collection. Some of them are broken, some of them are yet to explode. On the wall. Thanks to everyone for coming. I'm happy to answer the questions about any of these cars. My books are for sale. Describe
We're going to do it right.
racing cars from the philosophical viewpoint.
I just got here.
Go to the Young Artist Orchestra. You get a nickel discount with every autograph. We're trying to promote this raffle where I will take you to lunch in either the Type 51 or the Russia Bugatti. And lunch is the place of your choice. So thanks for coming, and see you next year.
I might.
Well, thanks.
Well, I don't want to go wrong. This one, or the one with the cover.
Cut out for you, 4. Ron Weber.
That's a beautiful car. I still like it.
He hasn't heard the two previous things we've given, which were incredibly boring. We're going to give another lecture, which is even more boring right now on what these various cars are. Russia from 1921. It was actually designed before the First World War. It is a racing car. It's kind of a Formula 2 car, or voiturette as they're called. It was the car. It's a sort of spindly, cute-looking little car, but they used to race them 300 miles, 500 miles on dirt roads. A 1922 Bugatti. Let's see, 1923 Bugatti had Grand Prix car. It's an early experiment in aerodynamics. In its day, the current accounts of it say that it didn't raise any dust. The other cars had great plumes of dust going by. This one had no dust at all. It's a very terrifying and difficult car to drive because it has no firewall. And you sit right next to the engine, and your driver's suit gets soaked with gasoline, and there's sort of flames and pouring machinery and asbestos from the gas with the...
Sounds like fun.
Yeah, we always have sort of last prize in the Bugatti contest is somebody that has to drive this thing and do something. Now, the only thing you learn in restoring old cars is patience. This one, I got the engine in 1975, and here it is. Finally, in 1986, I get to drive the complete project. We weren't working on it all the time, but some of the time for that time. The average gestation from one of these things from when I buy it to when I get to drive it is 7 years. So it's just forever. It's much more complicated to restore a car than to build a house, because I've done both, and they're more more fussing around and